Hello, Asao Inoue, or did I say that right or well
Yes,
enough?
you did.
All right.
Absolutely.
Welcome to Everyday Anarchism. I have you on the show today to talk about contract grading, which I have to tell you, Asao, I've never feel like I've taught a really successful class in my
Mm.
entire career in which I wasn't using contract grading. I mean,
Mm.
it just transformed my teaching and my relationship with the students and everything. I learned about your work from one of my friends and colleagues, Jane Danielowitz, and she recommended your work to me and loved it. So I wanted to have you on the show to talk about the way that contract grading, in this everyday anarchist sense, empowers the student, removes some of the hierarchy, and makes the class in like mutual aid in some way. If that framing sounds good to you, and if it does,
Yeah.
tell us why.
Yeah. I think, well, let me start by saying, like, I had a very similar experience when I first started using contract grading. And I've told the story before in different ways in different venues, but I'll just tell you, recount it briefly. It's my sort of origin story of grading contracts.
Yes.
So mine was I was introduced to grading contracts in about 2004 with by Peter Elbow, and I just happened to get really, really lucky. And I was a PhD student, so I guess it was 2003, I think. I was a PhD student at Washington State University, and one of my mentors there was Bill Condon, who is retired now, but he was, did lots of assessment work, and he happened at that time be the co-editor of a journal, and he said, "You should put this seminar paper. Well, let's revise it, and you should submit it to the journal, and they'll get it blind reviewed and so forth." And one of the reviewers, I did that, and one of the reviewers was Peter Elbow, and he signed his review, and he offered this really lengthy review. Now, my article that ended up getting published was on community-based assessment pedagogy. I think that was the title of it. It wasn't contract grading. It didn't do contract grading, but Peter signed his thing. He put his phone number on there and said, after the review at the very end, he said, "P.S. I'd really love to talk to you about something that I think that would work really well with this system." And it was contract grading. And of course, I was just a graduate student at the time, and Peter Elbow was telling me to call him. So I called him. It was he was a super, super generous, nice guy. And
So I'm going to jump in here and just
yeah.
tell people that, if you're not in the literature and rhetoric and composition game, you probably don't know who Peter Elbow is. But if you are in that game, Peter Elbow is an absolutely legendary writing teacher. I mean, when you sit down to take a class on how to teach writing, I cannot imagine that Elbow is not in that class ever.
Right.
That's how influential a figure he is.
He was one of the first in the field that I was introduced to as well years before in my master's program. So I was pretty starstruck by this, and he gave me a version of his one of his grading contracts at that time, and I fiddled with it, and he gave me permission to use it in my classes, and I started using it. At the time, it was a hybrid version that is not a pure labor-based like I do now, which it took me several years with experimenting and talking with students and thinking through and reading the literature to realize I need to move over to this because, one, it is more anti-racist, and two, it reduces some conflicts and some contradictions in that ecology, that assessment ecology that the hybrid version creates by having two kinds of judgments that count towards the grade. One being the judgment of, did you do this labor or work or not? I turned it in on time. And two, if you want a higher grade, is it a good enough quality according to my account of the teacher to get an A? So that never could sit well with me, given the students that I was teaching at Fresno State and at other places before that, Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. And so I quickly I figured out how to change it and move forward, found some folks in the field doing work in like the early 70s and late 60s who were doing almost contract grading. They just weren't calling it that. And it was almost labor-based, but they weren't calling it that. But they published a few things in College English and I think the 3C's journal. And it was pretty amazing that there was a little bit of a history of this. And so once I did that, just like you, Graham, I found my classroom transformed in amazing ways. The number one thing that I found, even with hybrid contracts, the number one thing I found in my classrooms that changed was my relationship with students.
Yes.
It got so much better. And my relationship to their languaging and their writing got so much better. And in fact, I stopped dreading the stack of papers because I knew before I had this stack of papers I got to read. And then I knew somewhere in that stack, I was going to get upset. And I didn't want to get upset. I thought that's not what a teacher is supposed to do. I'm not supposed to. They're supposed to be able to make mistakes. They're supposed to be able to take risks, and so forth. So that was a big bonus, and I never turned back. I was never able to. I'm like, how could, once I've tasted the forbidden fruit, I'm not going to go back to. So that was my introduction, and he was absolutely right in all the important ways. We disagreed down the road about a couple of things, but in the important things, Peter and I agreed about this, and he was absolutely an important person in introducing me. He was the person who introduced me to contract grading, and so I am forever in his debt for that. So yeah.
Okay, so I think we've already jumped ahead a bit in terms of talking about labor-based versus hybrid, and we talk about portfolio. We're going to need to give people this language because, again, sure. I can tell you at the last school I was at, literally no one had even heard of contract grading. So it's so look, it's sure. It's insane. But before we do that, I want to say this is the transformative thing, and you're absolutely right. The thing I want to talk about is the way that contract grading does true inclusion rather than some kind of neoliberal technocratic numbers counting inclusion. It is anti-racist because it is removing the system of value in the teacher's head, which cannot be anything but suffused with racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism. We'll get to that as well. But just for to proselytize, because there are plenty of professors out there who listen to this podcast. I used to have a friend who would say, I teach for free. They pay me to grade the papers. And you are absolutely right, Asao. These students put their heart and soul into a paper if you do contract grading and you read it to comprehend, to understand. It refigured my relationship to my students' papers, the same relationship I had with the New Yorker. I would sit down to read, to learn something, to connect, sometimes to be outraged and rant about how I thought they were wrong or their writing was bad. But I do that with the New Yorker also. And so not only is it a space that empowers students, it took my job from drudgery, everything but the grading, everything but the grading was not drudgery, but the grading was drudgery. Well, and there's a few other things. And all of a sudden, the stack of papers, I treated it like a stack of magazines that I wanted to read. And I've never heard of anyone say that, Asao, ever, who isn't doing contract grading, especially with introductory students who supposedly cannot do really good and interesting work. Supposedly, if you're like me and most of your classes have been students who are just entering college or a college type environment and they're just learning how to write, supposedly they can't do good work. That's bullshit. They can. And if they're not doing good work and you're a writing teacher, you're handcuffing them in some way.
I think also we have to get past our ideas, our fairly limited ideas of what good writing is. I think one of the important things that a labor-based contract graded, or even really most contract grading environments or ecologies can offer a teacher, not just the students, but what it can offer the teacher, is a freedom from not being able, and I think it's a freedom. It's not just a limitation, but it's a freedom from not being able to explore the other stuff that's going on in the classroom. You're confined to say, I got this rubric, I got these dimensions, I got these expectations. They come from my discipline. They're good. I'm not arguing whether they're good or bad. I'm just saying you got those. And now you have blinders on. You can't see the other stuff that could very well be critical, earth-changing stuff that's really important. Why wouldn't it come from an 18-year-old? Why can't it? I think the only reason why we think it can't tends to be because we have already made that assumption when we walk into those papers. So now I'm not saying that every single first year writing paper is something that we need to bronze and put. But what I am saying is that there's more than we think. There's more interesting. And I think that students ought to be given that opportunity. That is that they if it's their languaging. And that's them becoming right there in front of us. And
Yeah.
even if we might have tread those paths already as as languagelings in the world, as teachers of writing, even if we know this, yeah, I've discovered that, and it's nice that they're getting it, but that's their learning journey. I get to have the privilege of witnessing it. And isn't that an incredible gift? I mean, I think that's really so. What gets in the way of that gift, and that makes us not see it as such, I think, is that we got to take our expectations and turn them into grades, and then rank all of our students, and then tell some aren't going to get to pass, or some get these opportunities, some don't get other opportunities, et cetera. And then it sours our relationship with their language and them. And I think that's a tragedy, and it doesn't need to happen that way. And it doesn't have to mean, I don't think it means, at least it hasn't in my experience, meant that once you start doing contract grading, that somehow you're giving away grades, somehow students aren't doing what they're supposed to do. I've found absolutely the opposite of that. I mean, exactly the opposite. So that is not, and I don't think that's the case of just me having a strong personality. I know that me as a male cisgendered brown man who speaks in a very particular way and has a particular affectation in person and online, that yes, I have a strong personality in a number of ways, and that affords me the abilities to do certain things as a teacher with students. But everyone has their affordances, no matter who they are as a teacher. So we just have to know them and continually work with them and be cognizant of them in our classrooms and know what they're going to not let us do and what they are going to let us do. So I'm not going to say that like every teacher can do what I do or what you do. Of course not. We have our own different ways of doing those things, and we just have to find them and work with them. But I think what we're talking about there are the ways in which we enter as a teacher. We enter those spaces of the classroom, not the ecology of the assessment. That is the assessment ecology itself. So how do we enter the ecology? That's one thing. How the ecology exists is a much larger thing. I mean, the only one element in this in the 7 elements I've identified in ecologies.
Okay, so I've got a dozen things to say in response to that. And I do want to talk about the ecology, but we need to go back and just say, please tell us. You and I know what contract grading is, and that's why we jumped ahead. But when you say contract grading, if someone says, "Hey, Professor Inoue, what is this? What is contract grading?"
Well, contract grading is a set of agreements that are made, and you don't have to call it a contract. Some people don't like that term because it participates a bit too much in capitalist notions about like individual. And I totally get that. However, I will say that I continue to use it only because I've used it before, and it's an opportunity for my students and I to talk about those connections with cultures and environments that use contracts between an individual and another entity. The contract in my classes is with the classroom. It's a social contract. So it's a very different kind of contract. Now, I could easily call it an agreement, a set of agreements that we make with each other. It is not an agreement that the student is making individually with me. That would participate in white supremacy culture, in my opinion. And folks, we can talk about that if you like. But I use it as a way to have a social contract, which means when I'm engaging in the contract negotiations with students and they're engaging with me, we have to make clear that our decisions and our thinking about what we are going to put down as the contract for all of us is social, meaning what's good for everybody, not just what's good for me as an individual who's trying to work through this thing. Certainly what's good for everybody will be good for me because I'm part of everybody, but I'm situated in an everybody, in a group. And that's how I want us to have it, because that then allows us to, I think, meaningfully confront questions about competitiveness in educational contexts and grade grubbing and acquiring this and working against the teacher or against students, because you're always in competition with them. They are your competition in the grander, larger, outside the classroom. But in this space, we're going to try to recognize that and critique it through thinking about grades in this setting. So it's a set of social agreements that we set up. In my class, we use labor-based, but there's also hybrid-based contracts, which use both labor and judgments of quality on paper to determine final course grades. But what is the same in both of those systems is that the contract system tries to take out as many, if not all, of the grades and rankings and numbers and letters in the day-to-day workings and practices and documents that are produced by students that we call learning as we can. In my class, it takes all of them out, and the only grade is the institutionally mandated final course grade. We don't want to get to not and do that. And we have to determine, what does it mean in terms of labor through the semester or quarter? How much labor do you do to give yourself that grade, to get that grade? And what happens when you don't do that work? So when you don't do the labor and you don't turn it in on time, or you don't turn it in at all, and so forth. And that can mean different things. Like in the last year or two, I've been teaching asynchronous online first-year writing courses. And they're different, obviously. Asynchronous online course is different than just a straight online course, or in which you're having classes on Zoom, or a face-to-face course. So, which of course I've taught all of those and used a grading contract in all of those, and it's worked just as well in any of those settings. It looks different. Some things look a bit different because they have to, because we don't get to meet and so forth. I will say it is easier to meet face-to-face and talk face-to-face with students and be able to have conversations about, what does this contract mean? And how does it change our responsibilities to each other and to our work and the labors that we do for each other and for ourselves and so forth. So, but that's the nuts and bolts of it. It is a contract. It's a set of agreements that students make with each other and with the teacher that determine the final course grade, and that's all. And in my case, it's labor.
And in terms of labor, so you can visualize this at home. If you're thinking about, okay, what happens in writing class? Well, students are going to write papers. Perhaps that's the only thing that's going to happen. But we also always teach writing as a process. So along the way, students are going to discuss papers, they're going to revise papers, they're going to write drafts, they might be doing some reading, they have to come to class, etc. And then you do all of this work, and then the only thing that happens is just the papers sometimes get assigned a number between 0 and 100. And then the students are all like, so I can just not do the drafts, right? And I'm like, no, you're required to do the drafts. And I'm like, but you're not grading them. And I'm like, yeah, but I think that's the danger of point systems and letters and number systems, is that it encourages students, if they're smart and savvy students, it encourages them to think about when they have to, right? When time is of the essence and they've only got so much time, which all students do, and they decide, what can I not do and get the grade that I'm okay with in this class? So it's that old, like, how much can I not do, and how quickly can I get that what I have to do done? And that's often what point systems and letters and number systems do, because it says there's a hierarchy. This assignment's more important than that because it's worth 20 points and that's worth 15, and or whatever the numbers and letters are. So I think that doesn't go away magically in a contract system, but it does. The contract system does establish a more equalizing sense of, like, at least in my classes, an hour's worth of labor is an hour's worth of labor. And so what you produce will vary because we're all different and we all have different conditions that we learn in. And so let's try to accommodate that. That is, let's try to understand that and figure out what's the best agreements we can come to. Typically in my classes, in a reading labor, for instance, like it's not about finishing the chapter that's assigned a chapter. It's about, we agree that we're going to do this many hours of labor in a week. And that's portion of it. So we're doing, let's say we've estimated that it's 2 hours of reading labor. That's what, spend 2 hours doing that. And then if you get halfway through, you get halfway through. So that means I have to adjust my pedagogy in class. So I can't assume that all of my students have read all of it. Just depends. And we find that out. But I've never been able to assume that all my students have read it, even when I was grading. So I still had to do that before. So I'm still doing that. You know what I mean? I was still. It's just I was expecting everyone to be able to have the same access to time.
that they before. And now I'm not, and I'm making it obvious. So
this, if you draw an analogy, which I'm doing with like the idea of political anarchism. So when you tell someone that you believe in anarchism, they'll say something like, "Oh, so then we would just have crime everywhere. There'd be all sorts of violence, and people would be stealing constantly." And the anarchist response is like, I mean, yeah, probably, but like,
isn't that happening now?
Could it really get worse? So when you say, "Oh, we're going to do this contract grading," and the students just have to turn in a 900-word essay, and then they will get at least a B if they did that and all the steps. Like, well, but then how do you know they're really doing their best? I'm like, well, you
never have known that.
You don't know that. How do you know they're reading if you're not giving them a grade for reading? Well, how do you know they're reading?
I think a lot of the when I talk to teachers about their concerns about like those kinds of concerns about giving up those things in their classes, it is often, not always, but it's often about giving up that control of students. It's just that I gave up a long time ago. I gave up my need to feel in control, not just of my class, but I don't want to control my students. I certainly want to guide them, and I want to create an environment, an ecosystem, an ecology that encourages everyone to be able to do just exactly what they can in this moment, because that's all they get, right? So, and that we can all feel good about those labors and that learning. That's what I want. So, and I think that can happen. And it may very much look like anarchy to some. I mean, I'll tell you, early on when I was doing a contract grading, this was at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. And this was like my first job out of PhD. And I was teaching a first year writing course, and one of my students came up to me after class. This is about week 3, maybe in a semester, and she was still getting the hang of the class, and she was a very traditional A student. She was white and middle class. This was not the norm of the class. It was probably half the students in this class were African American, and they were all most of them were working students and so forth. So this is very like first gen type class. She came in, and she was a good student. She was very conscientious. And she came in and said, "Can we stop the what did she put it? She said it was she said, "Can we stop the circus? Like this is in like," and I said, and she almost said it exactly that way. And I said, "Whoa, first know your audience before you, but tell me what you're," and she just couldn't understand. She had a very hard time in a system that wasn't validating her at the top of the pyramid, because that was where she was used to being. Yeah. And we talked about that a little bit. And I said, just give it to the midpoint when we get to renegotiate our contract. Give it to that point and see how you feel. But you gotta take it, you gotta give me some faith. Like you got to trust that I know at least a little bit of what I'm doing, and that this is going to work out okay. Like really try to make it work. She's like, "Okay, I will." And to her credit, she did. And she ended up being the biggest proponent of the contract system by the end of that semester. And she did wonderful in the class and helped her colleagues a lot. And so it took a little bit of she just wasn't, she thought that a classroom was supposed to be this orderly place where I was going to tell everybody what the good writing was and how it was this and that. And that wasn't the classroom that I understand as being one that's going to be inclusive, one that's going to be able to encourage critical thinking, one that's going to do all the things I think we want in a classroom today.
Yeah, again, the parallel to anarchism is amazing, because people will say like, "Oh, well, it's going to be a circus." Like, no, like actually, the reason why we have hierarchies and governmental structures and all this stuff and contracts, like the traditional business 101 contract, is to create some form of order and harmony and flourishing. So what if I told you could throw away all that shit and still have harmony and flourishing? And they're like, "But I don't want to try that because that just seems wrong." I cannot stress enough how radical this is. In one sense, it's commonsensical. I know in your work you talk about, hey, it seems like people would learn better if this were a home studio class. Like, think about how you learn. If you're an adult, how do you learn? Like, if your buddy is going to teach you how to do something, there's not going to be grades, and you can just like it makes so much sense, but it cuts so deeply against the culture of standardization and supremacy.
Yeah, part of it, and I mean, just in that word supremacy is assumed a set of hierarchies. No matter what we're talking about, whether we're talking about race, talking about writing, those things are always linked together because it's language, and language is always associated with race, and at least historically it has been. And so, given that, I think we have to shed as much of those hierarchical assumptions and values that we can. And that includes the practices of grading, if that's possible. Or, I mean, I know it's possible, but I know that it means dramatic changes in many institutions because they're based on grades. And let's be very clear about what grades actually do, what function they serve. They don't serve a learning function. They don't help students learn. They don't even help students understand where they're at in it. We may say that they do, and they may look like they do, but they really don't. What they do is they serve an administrative purpose for processing as many students as possible with as little information on them as possible, because that's an efficient way to move those students like widgets through the machine. And so I'm not interested in participating in that kind of a system. I'm interested in helping students actualize themselves, figure out what they want, their own goals, and learn about themselves in the ways that they can in that moment. And in my classes, that's usually around language and so forth. So that doesn't require me, I think, to try to process students in the most minimal way possible. So, and besides, I'm more interested in creating classrooms that are student-centered, not institution-centered or even teacher-centered. And the second one, teacher-centered, is really hard because I like to talk, and I think I got some ideas. And I don't, if you give me a question, I'll talk for an hour if you let me. And so I've had to, over the years, and labor-based grading contracts have really, really helped me do this. I've had to step aside and let my students learn. I just had to get the hell out of the way. And it's really hard to get out of the way when everyone in the classroom is looking to you to find out how did you grade their papers and what do you think of their languaging. And you just can't get out of the way. There's no way to do it, really. You're always going to be in the way. And I firmly believe that most learning in classrooms happens when teachers get the hell out of the way. It doesn't mean they're not there. It just means they're out of the way,
Yeah, and helping and guiding is totally different from
exactly. Yeah.
So I want to just dwell a second on the language that you've used. You're talking about white supremacy in a way that I think, hopefully a lot of this work has been done, that white supremacy does not only mean the KKK and people in robes and whatever. Yeah. And we understand that. So I don't think you and I need to recapitulate that on this podcast. If you're bothered by that, listener, Google Ta-Nehisi Coates white supremacy and you're good. You'll get it. But don't ask me to spell Ta-Nehisi Coates right now because I can't. But with that said, the white part should be obvious if you're thinking about a language classroom. Like Asao and I, we teach English and writing. Well, it's English. It's right there in the name. If you're going to get a grade, it's going to be matching the standards drawn from. This is why you take class in America. You take an English class in America. What the fuck, English? And they say, oh yeah, because you need to write. Well, actually, you're taking an English literature class, and it starts with goddamn Beowulf. Right? It starts with Beowulf. Like, what am I doing? I'm taking a symposium on the culture of my people. And apparently, quote, my people is, the Germanic peoples of Northern Europe. So that's the white part. And then the supremacy part is, grading. Everyone is going to be ranked in accordance to their place, to the extent to which they cohere with the great Anglo-Saxon tradition of language. And if you're a teacher, how can you not be? If you're someone like you and I who have gone through all of this teaching, all this learning in English, geared that way, I was assigned Beowulf so many times, how am I not going to be part of that tradition?
Right. And I think
go ahead.
I think that's the struggle that we have as teachers, because that is our training, right? I mean, you're absolutely right that when most of us learn English as a discipline and then become professors or teachers and so forth, whether it's high school or college or whatever, we learn from those traditions, and we have to be mindful and name those traditions appropriately so that we don't make the mistake of thinking that what we're teaching is something else, like some neutral conveyance of communication of ideas. It is not neutral. It comes from a group of people, actually a subgroup from a group of people,
Yeah.
right, of language users, and that starts the hierarchizing, right? So I always like to tell folks, like in a labor-based grading contract classroom, they always ask, well, do you give up your standards and your expectations? Like, no, I don't give up any of my expectations. I still get to have them. I just don't have to lord them over all my students. So they still get the benefit of hearing from my training and my background, but now I have to be more explicit about exactly where those things come from and what they mean and what the consequences are if you want to follow my ideas, which you're not obligated to. But if you do, here's the consequences for you or for someone else in the world when that happens and it gets circulated. So, but it also means we got other resources in this room, other students who come from different language backgrounds or have slightly different ones that you get to hear from, and you get to make authentic choices about that. One of my mottos in my classes, which I've repeated in other places, is good writers make decisions, they don't follow orders. Yeah. So a good reader like me shouldn't give orders. They should give thick descriptions of their experience of your text. So I'm going to offer a thick description. Who am I? How did I get these expectations? Where they come from? How do I locate them in the text? And then you get to decide, how do I want to use that information as a writer? And then I put it next to these other folks. And then we get to actually problematize those language practices and say, how is that part of me? How is that part of larger structures in the world and histories? And what am I willing as a writer what am I willing to participate in? Am I willing to participate in that when I do this? Or am I trying to write against that and make my readers mad? I hate this blind adherence that I hear in some cases in teachers. I don't mean to make that so heavy-handed, but I'll say it that way. That some teachers think it's about knowing your audience and writing to your audience, as if audience isn't race, isn't gendered, isn't historicized, and therefore what's appropriate becomes the most important thing, appropriate for that genre, appropriate for that audience. But we lose the idea of the fact that that's somebody's expectations. That's some groups. And that means we still participate in those white supremacist hierarchies when we do that, if we're not careful. So we have to be very careful when we do that.
Okay, so here's what I want to do next, because I don't want to go on too much longer, because I want people to be able to listen to this all the way through, even though just like my students, I know that there are plenty of listeners who don't listen all the way through, and I accept that. I'm not in charge of your time, and I was not in charge of my students' time either, despite that, the social contract. We collectively decide the amount of time that we can spend. A wonderful idea. So the next thing I want to say, you and I are writing instructors first and foremost, and people tend to say, oh, okay, maybe this works for you guys, but I couldn't use a labor-based contract for math or chemistry. But I actually took a class that was, he wasn't calling it contract grading, but I took Calc 2 in college in a way that was kind of done like this. Like, I would invite you to think about, if you are an instructor of any kind, doing something like this, regardless of what you are teaching. And I want to see, Asao, if you thought also that this it's not going to be exactly the same, but this could be modified to teach anything, I think.
And yeah, of course. And I think I certainly have talked with and worked with lots of professors and teachers all over the country who have done exactly that, whether they've been teaching in STEM fields or math or physics or something like that, but far afield from writing and English classrooms. So definitely, there's definitely possibilities. In some cases where they just don't see the way. So like, I can understand a chemistry teacher, for instance, or an engineering teacher saying, well, my students they literally have to know these 10 things, whether they're theories or whether they're some kind of formula, because they're going to use those and they have to know them very well. And so, okay, I get that. I'm not saying that it can work perfectly for those kinds of situations, but I will say that there are other, I'll say, ungrading adjacent practices out there. Linda Nielsen's specifications grading, for instance, is a really good example of this that I think translates pretty well for those who are looking for a middle ground between what we're talking about here and something that's not a ranking system that says A, B, C, let me grade this and so forth. So they can look to her work in specifications grading that does this, which basically says it's a toggle. You have to have these 10 specs and then you move on to the next thing. And then if you acquire this many, you get this grade and so forth. Then you can do it in any number of ways. But in effect, it does that. And it's sort of a middle ground for this. So I think I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the pedagogy of physics or the pedagogies of STEM fields, but I will say that most of those folks aren't experts in pedagogy either. So what they are is experts in chemistry. And so let's not confuse our specialties, and that the knowing of something isn't the same as teaching it. Just like knowing language ain't the same thing as teaching language. So my training and research is in the teaching and assessing of language. It's not in reading Beowulf. Yeah. I certainly can read Beowulf, but it doesn't mean I'm going to be able to say a lot of intelligent shit about it. So all I'm saying is, like, we have to be clear about what we really know. The problem that we often have as professors and teachers in any field is that we are so damn confident about what we do know that we forget that is a really bad substitute for projecting what we can offer our students and what will be guaranteed for them in the future. So just because I have had success as a languageling in the world, and I'm a good professor, and I've gone through the ranks, and I'm a full professor and blah, 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 doesn't necessarily mean that I know exactly what my students will need tomorrow to be successful in their worlds with their goals and their conditions. I don't, but I certainly can offer some practices and environment now that I think will help them today, and ask them to think about those things as a habit, to continually be mindful so that they can be ever vigilant of those changing conditions in their lives. But I can't know. And so therefore, having some kind of arbitrary standards about it. Now, that's not to say that a chemistry teacher doesn't have some things they just know they need to, okay, I'm not going to argue that. I'm just going to say that, remember, knowing chemistry and teaching it are not the same thing. And so, I mean, I can't tell you, I got two sons who are in college now, and they're in different fields, and I feel like I know better from the student's perspective about college students in math classes and engineering classes and such. I am not impressed with the teaching. I'm not impressed. Now, this is a parent. I'm now got my parent hat on, and I'm thinking about like, part of me wants to go and call up these professors and say, like, you're a bad teacher. You are not helping your students. Like, forget about this one student that I'm most interested in, but let's think about all of them when you do what you're doing in your classroom. Now, I'm not gonna. I don't want to badmouth other professors, because again, I'm hearing this secondhand from my sons who have their own interests, of course. So I don't want to pretend like it is the full. But I will say, like, as having been a previous associate dean in a pretty large college at Arizona State, I know that when I tabulate the student complaints and the complaints about classrooms and the complaints about teaching, it is slanted not in favor of the sciences and the STEM fields. There are more problems there, and it's pretty clear, at least to me, what those problems are, and they have a lot to do with not training faculty in the sciences and STEM fields in pedagogy, in the teaching of those things, because they obviously have other things that they have to care about, like to get tenure and be promoted, which has nothing to do with their teaching. And so they put that on the back burner. They put it on as a.
Yeah, another way that I want to talk about this is to take it back to supremacy, which is to say that the students have these problems with these teachers, right? Mm-hmm. And there's nothing they can do about it except write this anonymous thing at the end of the year, which is this classic kind of like technocratic, like, now you're going to grade the teacher, and then there's an associate dean who is going to grade them, and it's like well, let's build this enormous enforcement mechanism to make sure the teachers are good teaching, when the people who have the knowledge are the students. And a grading contract invites them to participate in the teaching of the class. And let me tell you, I've worked at multiple STEM schools. The STEM people don't like the idea that the students are.
I get it. I understand. They want to make arguments. Well, the arguments I've heard is like, well, if you do contract grading, like you can't really do it in my field because they have to know X, Y, and Z very particularly, and I know what they have to know, and because bridges will fall down if you don't. And I want to say, like, look, a grade ain't never built a good bridge.
Yeah.
What built a good bridge were people who learned some shit. And if they learned it and kept it and applied it. So grades don't do that. If your classroom, if your course structure, if your curriculum is so flimsy and so weak that if you take the grading out, that all of a sudden learning stops and it starts to erode in these then you might want to rethink what you're doing in that class, because that's to me a bigger pedagogical problem, a curricular problem but it also is, what a crappy perspective to have on your students, to think that you have to force and coerce them into doing the stuff that they and is good for them, that is learn the stuff in the course. So I feel like students often react to, for good reason, react to the conditions that they're in. So if the conditions they're in are coercive and untrusting and so forth, like grading systems tend to be, doesn't matter how nice the words are of the professor. Your words can be really flowery and nice and be real kind and soft spoken, but if your grading structure in the classroom is counter to that, what do you think the students are going to do? They're going to listen to the grading structure because that's what's going to leave, that they're going to leave with. So I think that we have to be mindful of those kinds of factors when we do this, because it suggests bad assumptions that we have about our students. What I prefer is to build a really strong, pedagogically sound curriculum that is inviting and open, so that my students want to do more work. They want to learn. They see the value in it. And if they don't, they're just not ready at that moment. They're just not, and I can't force them to be ready. I mean, imagine if someone comes into an environment and they don't want to do the stuff in that environment that's required of them, like learn, and you force them to do it. You force their hand. They're not going to learn anything. They're going to do exactly what they're forced to do and nothing else. And they're going to leave pissed off and call you names. And you're going to feel crappy about having to force them to do it. And nobody wins. So I don't see why I don't want to participate in that. I'd rather create an environment that's inviting and welcoming and open and shares power with students and says, let's do this thing together. And if you're not ready, you're not ready. That's okay. I'm not going to judge you on that. You got your journey. Heaven knows I flunked enough of my classes because I wasn't ready when I was an undergrad. So yeah, I think we have to be more generous with our students and more compassionate towards them. And part of that means sharing power and giving up some of the control that we think we need in order to teach them something. When in fact, what we need to do is give up power so that they have the room to learn. And that's a very different thing. That's the same as that. Get out of the way, man. I think it really does come back. It really does matter in the STEM fields just as much as in humanities and social sciences. So I think that STEM fields are different in some ways, but I don't think they're as different as many folks think they are.
Yeah, I agree.
So
I guess two quick notes about STEM, and then we can move towards wrapping up. One, like John Dewey would say, hey, if you want your students to learn how to build a bridge, tell them that they should build a bridge and get them excited, and they'll come to you begging. They'll come to you begging to learn mathematical concepts because they're so excited about the bridge. It's like, and who doesn't want to build a bridge? That sounds awesome. I don't know how to build a bridge. Sounds awesome, yeah. But I would love to learn, right?
Right.
The other thing is going all the way back to my experience, first semester with a math professor who taught this way. This is for you STEM people, so you can do it. It was kind of a specifications thing. He said, for Calc 2, there's 16 kind of problems you need to do. And I'm just going to give them to you over and over again. That's the exam. And we're going to work on them between the exams. And once you've done whatever number of them, you've got an A. And if you do, between this number, then you've got a B, whatever. So in that way, it was fairly, it accorded with standard grading. And it was like a content-based thing rather than a practice thing. You have to know how to do this. But I loved it for the first time in my life. But you're right. But I think was also a more generous system that allowed students to sit. It was clear that it said,
you have your own pace, and I'm not going to force my pace on you. So I'm just going to require you to learn these concepts or these things, these problems. So I'll work with you until you get to the point where you can get to, and then that's where we're at.
Yeah.
So,
and I don't know anyone who didn't learn more in that class, whatever the grade they ended up with, than any of the other math classes.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It's almost like learning is not the goal of college classes, as you've said before. Right. Well, that may be the goal of the teacher, to make the students learn. The goal of the student is so often to get a grade, and that's because the goal of the class, the university, and indeed the entire system surrounding the university,
is to acquire those grades.
Yes. Grade them. I mean, grades, as you say, move the widgets to the factory. I like to tell my students, grades are for beef, right? Grades are quality control. Grades are like, make sure something is not contaminated. You guys are people. You are not a potential industrial contaminant.
And I think the best way to offer that critique of grades in the system is to offer a new grading system in your class that confronts that problem and shows an alternative, right? So I always like to say, like, the best way to understand today, socially or otherwise, is to look to science fiction, because they're going to show you a world that doesn't exist, but it could. Good science fiction, it might exist someday, or it might offer a way to reframe the questions that we think we hold so dear and that we think we understand really clearly, when we don't. All we have to do is say, change these assumptions, that's what I think I like about science fiction so much, is that we buy into the idea that, on different planets and different galaxies, things work differently. And so now our assumptions have to be different, right? And we have to have an open mind about, okay, and it's wondrous and interesting and fascinating, but it ends up exploring the really important problems that we might be able to deal with here if we just changed our assumptions. Like the whole idea of we've got to rank all of our students, and they've got to, that somehow makes for a better university when they've got all these students who are ranked, and they're ranked highly, next to their colleagues or their institutional peers, which I find just so hilariously ridiculous. Like, that is like I used to say when I was at Fresno State, I would say this a lot. I don't say it so much anymore. I don't know why, but I used to say, do you want an education? You want a Harvard education? You can get a Harvard education right here. Yeah. A Harvard education right here. All it means is how hard you want to work. How much work do you want to put in? That's the nature of education. You can have any schmuck go to Harvard and do nothing, graduate, do very little, just enough to graduate. And they didn't learn anything more. They're not going to be brilliant. They're just going to have got a Harvard degree that has some cachet in our systems today. That's only because of the name. But if you want to learn something, you can get that anywhere. You can go to community college and get that, and that's because it has very little to do with the college. It has more to do with what you're willing to put into that, and the orientation you bring to that classroom when you come. So you decide. The problem today that I find, like at Arizona State, where a lot of students are working and they have a lot of other demands on their time, and the institution, because the institution knows that the quicker time to graduation means more graduations, so they encourage a lot of students to pack their schedules more so than I've ever seen before. Like, I'm talking, I've had students this last semester who were taking 18, 20, 21 credits. Why would you take 21 credits? It's insane to do. And not fluffy classes. They were taking hard classes that require a lot of labor. And that doesn't serve anybody but the university, in my opinion.
Yeah, but the students think it serves them because they come from this achievement mindset. Right. Which has supremacy at its basis, which is another thing I would say. Like, you said, oh, hey, you might not learn that much at Harvard. I would go somewhat further and say, you know what Harvard is probably going to teach you? It's going to teach you to destroy the environment. It's going to teach you how to cut costs in a business you might be running, which is to say, fire people. Like, I think the best case scenario at Harvard is that you don't learn that much and you come out of there kind of unharmed but credentialed.
I don't want to drag Harvard through the mud, but I will say, I do. But anyway, go ahead. But I'll say, like, if you want to go to Harvard, then you should probably ask, why do you want to go to Harvard?
Yes.
And if you can answer that question and still say I'm going to Harvard, then okay. All right, then you might be able to make some, just as that student who would go to Fresno State or somewhere else says, I want a Harvard-like education, which means I want a deep, good education that's going to serve me well and my community well. Okay, you can get that anywhere. So then that's the nature of your choice at education. So great, both of those I think can work. But yeah, the difficulty is that usually on the front end, most folks who are making that decision are making it because of those reasons that you're like alluding at, which is I want to succeed monetarily, I want to have a good job, I want to blah blah blah, and all those things are great and important. I'm not saying it's not great to have a good job. I'm just saying that usually we change our minds about what it means to have a good job as we move through our life. I think initially we often think about it as money. A good paycheck, and down the road we realize maybe in midlife, at least this has been my experience with lots of my colleagues and myself, is that we ask ourselves, my job sucks, I don't like my job, or I don't like what I'm doing, I want to change it, I want to feel happy, I want to feel good about what I'm doing and how I'm contributing to the world, and you can't feel good about it if all you get from your job is a paycheck. So yeah.
I think that's all true. I would also just say, though, that for the individual players of this terrible game, if what you want out of your job is fulfillment and satisfaction, it still might be the best idea to go to Harvard because in this supremacist society, it's so often the people who are like the most miserable and working 90 hours a week, they often have Harvard degrees or Ivy League degrees. But the people who have the really cushy, self-actualized jobs, a lot of those people have great credentials also. You know what I'm saying? Like if you want to be in a place where you can trade off money and prestige for like quality of life, well, it turns out they're looking for high-ranked people also, even if there's a good quality of life.
And that's usually the trade-off.
But they can.
So I don't know.
Look, this is a much bigger.
But actually, it speaks, I think, to what grading contracts offer an educational environment, which is the currency in the market for good jobs is salary, right? Like money and benefits. It really boils down to economics. But in the classroom, the economics are grades.
Yeah.
And so we've already found the root of one of the problems. Like when you turn things into a ranked monetary or economic system of ranking, then you get bad things, and people start to strive for and reach for those rankings or numbers or money, and not for the deeply satisfying life, the good things for the community, all the stuff that's supposed to represent, right? So it's the classic case of a student wanting the A and not realizing that the A is supposed to mean good learning, right? Yeah. Deep learning, which is what they should want, which is what the STEM professors I was mentioning before are assuming is an A represents when a bridge is built. A bridge is only built when engineers are good learners. A bridge is not built when engineers get A's. It may turn out those things coincide, but if your system's set up so for you to acquire grades, it is not a good system to guarantee good learning. A good learning system is a good learning system, and it's outside of grades, or it should be. So.
And then, this is why that you begin your contract with a thought experiment. Imagine the classroom isn't set up this way. Imagine society isn't set up this way. It is another world. It is another world is possible, and contract grading will transform your class into a little utopia, or at least it did for me.
Yeah, thank you. And I often have thought about recently about changing that some of that preamble to ask a different thought experiment. Now I'm kind of as you probably could figure out, I'm kind of a Trekkie. I'm a Star Trek fan.
You are in the right place here, sir.
Yeah. So I thought like one of my jokes with my wife, because we have Star Trek time right before dinner every night. And we'll watch some Star Trek. And I always joke, I can always spot, like especially in Next Generation, I can spot all the technology that we currently enjoy right now. Cell phones, iPads, all of them are used. I'm like, there it is. They got that. It even looks the same. Like so, but the point I'm making is that when you're in the mode of inventing a universe, Star Trek is a thought experiment in many ways. I'm not saying there's criticism we couldn't level on it. We certainly can. But
talk about white supremacy. But anyways, go ahead.
But I think that we can also think about like, well, if Star Trek really were like, if we could really transpose some of those ideas about like that we might take from Star Trek to a grading contract situation, one thing we might ask ourselves is, in Star Trek, how would that classroom really look? Is it really when they've already expressed, like in Next Generation, they've already expressed, we don't have any money. That's not our goal when we get into a career. We get it for meaningfulness and fulfillment and helping, explore the universe and make the world a better place and so forth. So I think if we have those assumptions, it's the same kind of assumptions that we can see in there's a really great book that I read a couple of years ago by an indigenous botanist.
Is it Robin Wall Kimmerer?
That is her, Kimmerer.
Amazing. She's
braiding
amazing.
Sweetgrass. Yeah, yes. Braiding sweetgrass. And so, but in it, she like weaves her own indigenous spiritual traditions and philosophies with biology. And it in my opinion, it transforms how you understand the person in the world and language and all of that. She even talks about that, her use of language and how it is infused in her own indigenous upbringing and philosophy, and in terms of the capitalization of certain pronouns and such, because of how the assumptions about that make people superior to plants and animals and the world, and then that allows us to rank them lower and then subjugate and exploit. And she's saying that's not what we have to be in relationship with the world, and I absolutely agree with that. And if we had assumptions like that, or changed, sort of decolonized our brains about grading and grades, we might bring a different sort of thought experiment to every classroom when we open that up with students, and figure out, how do we stay in right relationship with each other and still give ourselves a grade? How do we do that? Can I do that if I'm in control? Can I have a right relationship with you? I don't think I can, because now you're always thinking about how to please me. You're always thinking about, you're looking to me to get, I'm not going to be there tomorrow for you. That's what I used to tell myself. I can't stand over your shoulder and be the little homunculus on your shoulder and say, don't do that, change that. You're going to have to do that, and you're going to want to do that. And the world is going to want you to do that. And so let's try to create a self-conscious environment here that allows us to do that stuff together.
So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful place to end, except I'm going to ask you, if someone wants to get started thinking about contract grading, thinking about changing their approach, where can they go?
Well, on my website, I have a labor-based grading contract resource page that has a lot of stuff for students and teachers, blog posts, podcasts, and other things that students can listen to and teachers can listen to, other resources, articles. They can also, on there, I believe, is also listed my book on labor-based grading contracts. So they can go to that, and that gives both how I came to the practice, what undergirds and is the foundation for my practice as a labor-based grading, as an anti-racist practice, and then the how-to, like what is a contract, what does my contract look like, how do I lead my students through it in a semester, and what do we do with it, and how do we finish off at the end of the semester. So, and you should know that I've done this in first year courses, second, third, fourth, and graduate. I've done it at all levels. It doesn't matter. I use the same contract. We just negotiate it. So the negotiation might look and end up differently, but it is the same. The other thing I'll say is that some folks get concerned because the examples that I give in my work tend to be from universities and not from, say, something like a community college. But I've done this in those settings as well. And I know lots of folks who have as well. So, and they've used versions of or template contracts from my stuff. So it works there as well. In fact, I'm currently working with a large group of community and technical college faculty in the state of Washington to do exactly this. Institute labor-based grading contracts in first-year writing courses as anti-racist measures in those settings, and to transform the instruction of first-year writing and help the students in that state. And then the plan is after next year, hopefully if we can show success in it, which I know we can, we're hoping to get more funding from the state legislature of Washington to do something even bigger, which is expand it out into STEM fields and to other universities. The key in that project is mapping their assessment ecologies. I can't underline enough how important this practice is. You'd have to look at my first book to understand what an assessment ecology is, the 7 elements of it, and then use that as a framework to describe, we call it mapping because it's an ecological metaphor. So we're saying to map your existing ecology so that you really know what's actually happening in your classrooms before you go about mapping a new ecology, an anti-racist one based on labor. Once you do that, then you start to see all of the problems, all of the good things and bad things, and the things that need to change, and your affordances and your limitations in terms of institution as well as a teacher. And it's really, it's not just an external thing that you do as a teacher. It's also an internal knowing yourself as a teacher, like knowing, and it can be what we found in this project so far is that we're about 7 months in. We found that most teachers, and most of these teachers, they signed up, they've had some experience or no experience, but some have some experience with this, with labor-based grading, and certainly they consider themselves anti-racist in their orientations. But they found deep surprises at how much they participate in white supremacy just by mapping. So it's a really important activity that is not easy to do. It sounds easy, but it's not easy to do because you have to do some really hard thinking and really hard admitting, if you will, to go, okay, I think I may very well have been an agent of white supremacy and white language supremacy in my classrooms, and I can see it in my that shouldn't be some sort of marker of shame, right? It simply is. We are all, as we started, we all have participated in some way because that's our history. That's the history of the world. It's the history of the education enterprise. So if that is, then let's be honest about it. Let's name it, label it, and let's see how we can dismantle and change it. So in that sense, it's a project of anarchy. Because it's looking to dismantle all those things in a large scale.
Yeah, I agree. And then in that sense, also, as long as it's a collective project, it avoids the sort of, oh, we can pick on that person and see what's wrong with them, as opposed to we have all come up through this. You're not a teacher if you haven't in some ways been shaped by that system. Now we work together. This is anarchism also. Now we work together to make a new system, just like you said.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And so, we really try hard. I mean, I've tried really hard over the last few years in all the places that I've worked with faculty to emphasize that doing this kind of work, anti-racist assessment work, whether it's designing, understanding, implementing, it's not about shaming and blaming individuals. We all got some blame and shame to take on, but that is not the point of this. It is not to say, look at all the bad people over there, right? It is to say that we work in bad systems and histories, and we can change that. And that if we understand our complicity and our participation, we can change that. And we might not be able to change everything, but we at least understand our affordances and boundaries, right? And so we need to continually be on that road to do that. Otherwise, we can expect the same outcomes that we've been getting in the past. And those are not good outcomes. And if someone out there doesn't think that we've had bad outcomes, then they're probably in a privileged group, right? And they've just turned their eyes and ears away.
I mean, not only are they in a privileged group without a doubt, but boy, are they not looking.
They're not looking very hard. That's true. But I think we all have a chance to do even those, I mean, I have a lot of faith in people generally, no matter what their orientation is. I think that, anyone can, no matter whether they're conservative or whether they're whatever, or whether they're progressive or whatever it is, I think we all can learn from each other and we all can be better people. But we have to be on the same page about thinking about our histories and not simply celebrating the good stuff in them. There's lots of great stuff to celebrate, but there's a lot of bad stuff that we all should learn from. So.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Asao.
Thank you, Graham.